Imagine this: a young black boy, barely 16, walking down the street minding his own business, when out of nowhere, a group of police officers pulls him aside. No reason given, no questions asked, just an unjust arrest. His heart races, confusion and fear taking over as the officers handcuff him and make it clear that he's being treated differently, simply because of the color of his skin. But what happens next will blow your mind. As the officers start dragging him to the squad car, something unexpected happens. They haven't realized it yet, but the boy's father, someone they least expect, arrives on the scene. And that's when karma strikes hard. The tension in the air is palpable, and the officers are about to face a shocking truth that they never saw coming. In this story of racial injustice and the unexpected power of family, we witness a powerful moment that could change everything. What will happen when the officers realize who the boy's father is? Stay tuned to see how karma unfolds in the most unexpected way. You won't believe the twist that's about to happen. The young boy Malik had been walking home from school and the officers stopped him. He didn't know why they had singled him out. He hadn't done anything wrong. His heart pounded as they asked him questions, some of them so random, they felt more like accusations than inquiries. They told him to empty his pockets, even though he hadn't done anything suspicious. Malik kept his cool, trying to stay calm, but the overwhelming fear was hard to hide. He knew what this felt like, being treated as guilty without any reason. For years, his community had dealt with the same kind of injustice. It wasn't the first time someone was unfairly targeted because of their race, and Malik had heard the stories. But that didn't make it any easier to face himself. The officers were relentless, ignoring Malik's attempts to explain that he wasn't involved in anything illegal. They only grew more aggressive. One of the officers, a large man with a cold stare, seemed to take pleasure in the intimidation. What Malik didn't know was that his father, a respected lawyer in the community, had been nearby, overhearing the whole scene. Malik's father, David, had seen enough. He was a man who had spent his career fighting for justice, and now, the very thing he had dedicated his life to was threatening his own son. As David turned the corner, he had no idea just how intense this confrontation was about to become. As David turned the corner, he saw his son surrounded by the officers. His heart skipped a beat, and his stomach twisted. He recognized the officer in charge, the one who seemed to be leading the charge against Malik. This wasn't just any officer. This was Officer Stevens, a man whose reputation in the neighborhood was known for all the wrong reasons. Over the years, Stevens had been involved in multiple questionable encounters with the community, and many people, including David, had suspected there was more to his actions than met the eye. David walked towards them, his steps deliberate, but his mind raced. He needed to stay calm, but the sight of his son being mistreated pushed him to the edge. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Officer Stevens turned, recognizing David immediately. His face shifted ever so slightly, and for the briefest moment, a flicker of unease passed over him. But he quickly regained his composure, as if to remind himself that he was in control. "Just a little routine stop, Mr. Carter," Stevens said with a forced smile, but there was a tension in his tone. David knew better. He'd seen this game played out too many times. But what shook him was the expression on Malik's face, wide-eyed, confused, and hurt. He had hoped his son would never have to experience this kind of treatment, but here it was, right in front of him. David stepped closer, his voice unwavering. "Routine? It looks like harassment to me." He felt the weight of every word, knowing this wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about a system that had failed too many, and now it was his turn to fight back. The officers were beginning to sense that this wasn't a situation they could just sweep under the rug. Stevens tightened his grip on Malik's arm, almost as if trying to assert dominance, but David wasn't backing down. The air was thick with tension, and the crowd that had started to gather on the sidewalk watched nervously, unsure of what would happen next. This wasn't just about an unfair arrest, it was about something deeper. It was about power, race, and a broken system that needed to change. David knew this moment could make or break everything. In the midst of the growing crowd, whispers spread like wildfire. People were starting to take notice, some quietly recording the scene on their phones. David could feel the weight of their stares, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the pressure of being watched. This was no longer just about saving his son. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant going against the very system he had once worked so hard to navigate. David knew it wouldn't be easy. The odds were stacked against them, and he had seen too many cases like this turn ugly. But this time, he wasn't going to let his son become just another statistic. The moment stretched on, and the tension in the air felt like it could snap at any second. The air felt thick, almost suffocating as David stood face to face with Officer Stevens. Malik was still in handcuffs, his body stiff, his eyes never leaving his father. The officers around them seemed more on edge now, exchanging uneasy glances, their posture defensive. The crowd that had gathered grew larger, murmurs filling the space as more people began recording what was happening. David could feel their eyes, but it wasn't the bystanders he was worried about. It was the man in front of him, the one who had the power to turn this whole situation upside down. Stevens didn't back down, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a fear, a realization that things were spiraling out of control. He tightened his grip on Malik's arm again, making it clear he wasn't ready to let go, not yet. "Mr. Carter," Stevens said, his voice now clipped, his earlier calm facade starting to crack. "You need to step back. We're doing our job." David didn't flinch. "No, you're abusing your power," he shot back, his voice growing louder. "You've been doing this for years, haven't you? Targeting young black boys, treating them like criminals without cause. This stops now." The crowd fell silent, every eye trained on the scene, the tension building with each passing second. Some people had started to record, their phones raised high, but it wasn't just about the footage anymore. This was bigger. People could feel it. David wasn't just fighting for his son. He was fighting for every person who had ever been unfairly treated, who had felt the weight of the system bearing down on them. Officer Stevens hesitated. For the first time, he seemed uncertain, his hands twitching at his sides as if weighing his next move. His eyes darted between David and Malik, and something in his expression shifted, just for a moment. But that moment was enough to change everything. Then, out of nowhere, another police car pulled up. A new officer stepped out, a woman with a sharp look on her face. She had been watching the scene from a distance, and she didn't waste any time. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone no nonsense, scanning the situation quickly. David's heart sank. This was the moment. Everything depended on how this officer reacted. Would she back up Stevens, adding fuel to the fire? Or would she see the truth of what was happening? The tension was unbearable. Malik stood frozen, still handcuffed, watching his father. The officers were in a standoff, unsure of who would make the first move. The crowd held their breath, knowing this could go in any direction. David knew he had only one shot to get this right, but the clock was ticking, and with every passing second, the pressure mounted. The whole community was watching, waiting for justice. Would this be the breaking point, or would it all fall apart? The new officer, Officer Reyes, stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the situation, taking in the crowd, Malik, and then David. There was a moment of tense silence before she spoke again. "What's going on here?" Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, as if she could already tell this wasn't just another routine stop. David could feel his heartbeat in his throat as he met her gaze. This could be the break he needed. This could be the officer who would finally see reason. But then, just as Reyes seemed ready to intervene, Officer Stevens suddenly snapped. His face twisted with anger, and his voice rose, cutting through the growing tension. "Reyes, you don't know the whole story," he shouted, as if trying to cover something up. "This kid's got a history. You don't know what he's capable of." David's eyes narrowed. History? What history? Malik was just a teenager, a student trying to get home. Stephen's words felt like a cheap excuse, an attempt to justify his actions, but it was too late. David could see through the lie. He knew Stevens was making things up, fabricating a story to cover his own tracks. Then, something even more unexpected happened. Reyes, for all her sharpness, hesitated. The slightest flicker of doubt crossed her face. For a brief second, she looked over at Stevens as if asking for confirmation, and in that moment, everything froze. The crowd could feel it, the shift, the change in the atmosphere. It was as if the entire situation was teetering on the edge of a knife. Would Reyes back down? Or would she stand up for what was right? Just then, another car screeched to a halt on the street. A figure stepped out, tall and confident. David's breath caught in his chest. It was his colleague, Detective Williams, a man he had worked with for years, someone he trusted. But what was he doing here? David hadn't expected him to show up. He knew Williams was a straight shooter, a good cop, but this was different. What could he possibly add to this mess? Williams didn't waste any time. He walked straight up to Stevens, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. "What's going on, Stevens?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of authority. "You arresting this kid without cause." Stevens visibly tensed, clearly caught off guard by Williams' presence. The tension in the air thickened, and the crowd grew even more anxious, sensing something was about to break. Reyes looked between Williams and Stevens, her eyes filled with uncertainty. The whole situation had shifted. This wasn't just about a random arrest anymore. Now, it was about a battle of allegiances. David knew this was the moment that would define everything. If Williams stepped in, things could change. But if Stevens and Reyes remained united, they could crush everything David had worked for. David felt a mix of hope and dread. The stakes had never been higher. The situation had escalated, and there was no turning back now. Would Williams stand with him, or would the corruption he feared run deeper than he ever imagined? The next moments would decide it all, and the tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it could snap at any second. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath. Detective Williams stepped closer to Stevens, his presence demanding attention. "I don't know what's going on here," Williams said, his voice calm but firm. "But if you're making this arrest based on suspicion alone, that's not enough." "I know better, Stevens, and so do you." Stevens visibly bristled, his anger rising. "This kid is trouble," he spat, his voice cracking with frustration. But something in Williams' expression made Stevens pause. He knew Williams wasn't just going to let this slide. He took a step back, as if trying to regain his composure. "Enough," Williams said, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Release the boy, now." The crowd held its collective breath. Stevens hesitated, his eyes darting from Malik to Williams, and then to Reyes. For a split second, it seemed like he might push back, but then something shifted. Stevens exhaled sharply, as if realizing he couldn't fight this any longer. With a reluctant grunt, he unlocked Malik's handcuffs and stepped back, his face twisted with barely contained rage. Malik, though still shaken, looked up at his father with a mix of disbelief and relief. David didn't waste a second. He pulled his son close, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, but David's mind was still racing. It was over, but not quite. Before they could walk away, a voice cut through the silence. "You think this is over?" It was Officer Stevens again, his tone venomous. But this time, David didn't flinch. Stevens stepped forward, his face red with fury, but just as he opened his mouth to say something, Detective Williams turned sharply, his voice low but commanding. "Stevens, you're done here. I've already made a call. You've been under investigation for months. Your record's not clean, and everyone knows it."